Okay, so if you recall the last time we got together, David was saying, and even Dion was saying this too, which I think is important. You know, like when we have done the renovation grid up to this point, as ministries have kind of put their foot in the ring or their hat in the ring to kind of, you know, see what's going on. Basically, you kind of look at the first part of the grid and you see these church level requirements, and you okay, and then you get to the outcomes and it's like, okay, and then it's like all of a sudden the car goes into a ditch when you're talking about what does it really mean to be missional. And so as I was thinking about brokering this conversation, you know, my mind naturally goes to a couple of different areas. First is like the shepherd component, which is like what is going on in my own personal life that would warrant a conversation about this. And where have I failed at this and where have I succeeded at this? I think it's very appropriate for us when if we realize or if we agree that we struggle to articulate or envision a concept, I think sometimes we should do a self-assessment of, is this alive in our own lives? Okay? And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit from the shepherding side of the house. But then I also just want to talk about it from, you know, an awareness side of the house. And so when we talk about missional behavior, we're talking about the far right part of the grid, okay? And as we define it today, we are talking about the components of presence, proclamation, saturation, and conversion, okay? Presence, in essence, what we're talking about, it's the intentional relationship building that we do with people that we know or we think that we know don't know Jesus. I have personally built relationships with people that I thought didn't know Jesus, and then all of a sudden I find out they know Jesus. I don't abandon that friendship, okay? You know, but the reality is, like, if I get a sense in my neighborhood or in my family that someone is not a Christian, and I want to be intentional with that relationship. So that's what we talk about when we say presence. Okay, proclamation. Okay, now I was saved out of a movement that was Plymouth Brethren, and that was very much like cold turkey evangelism. So I am not opposed to. You know, I spent a summer in Myrtle Beach in 1998. I worked a full-time job, and as soon as we finished, we blitzed the pier. North Myrtle Beach, Surfside Beach, South Myrtle Beach. Share the gospel, share the gospel, share the gospel. People are going to help, people are going to help people. That was what I was raised up out of. And there's a part of me, honestly, that I still go there. You know, I've still seen people come to know Jesus in that. But at the same time, in the context of building these intentional relationships, we have a grace story. And that when we build those relationships, we have the opportunity to articulate that grace story. And we call it proclamation. Okay? Now, I'm fully in agreement that I think this is a both and. We build relationships in order that we could share our story. But at the same time, you know, I think about two people that I was able to lead to Jesus last year. One was a total stranger. And it was like the Spirit of God, I felt, was right in our midst. And I just basically was like, I don't think you know Jesus, and I think you absolutely need to repent of your sin and come into a right relationship with Him. And he just broke down. You know, so there are moments where that happens. And I think proclamation is, in this context, we want to build these intentional relationships so that we have the opportunity to share our story, okay? Be it in a personal manner or in a God-led conversation manner. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? Because what I'm not okay with is throwing evangelism out, you know, just to the curb and saying, you know, that there's no good in that. Because I think we still do see some fruit in that. Saturation. This is the concept within the idea of missional behavior where we repeatedly do this. And that it's not a bad thing if we find out that Mike is building a relationship with Kenny, but we also find out that John is building a relationship with Kenny. We don't have a jump ball to see who carries the relationship. We have an understanding that there's repeated opportunities for relationship. There's repeated opportunities for John's story, and maybe, who knows, John's story may not resonate as much with Kenny's story, but maybe Mike's does, or maybe collaboratively they do, okay? So we talk about saturation, that's the repeated opportunities. And then finally, conversion. The idea that we want to see people come to know Jesus. Do we control that? Depending on which church you ask, yes and no, okay? Now, you know our paradigm, okay? And I think that it's safe to say that many of us within our partnership of churches, this is a Holy Spirit-led thing. But it is a responsibility for us to live these things out in the hope that people will come to know Jesus. Will everybody come to know Jesus? Well, if we look at the data from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary over the last 2,000 years, their collection, of 20 centuries of evangelization? The answer is no. But we still hold out hope that some will. Okay? Does that make sense? So when we think about these things, the reality is, as I'm looking through our ministries, going through the grid, not just our ministries, but other ministries in Renovation Network, and soon to be, Christ Together as we partner. The reality is, there are some findings that we know up to this point when we look at things like the spiritual formation and missional behavior survey. That's what we've created. But the reality is, it doesn't even have to be that deep. I mean, you can look at Barna, you can look at Kinnaman and Lyons and their research. Missional behavior, as we understand it, as we've collected, it's just down. Okay? It's not like we found a secret pocket of churches that know how to do this really well. Okay? And so I think that this should carry some weight with us. That of all the churches that I've surveyed, are there a couple that really stick out to me? Yes, there are. And the two churches, there's one in South Carolina called Summit Upstate. They're now at 3 locations. And then there's Missio in Syracuse. Both of those were plants that were built with this DNA in mind. And so if people ask me, who's actually doing this in our network? I honestly would go to them and say, I feel like they've built this with a very intentional understanding in their curriculum, in their formation on Sundays, everything. Their small group environments. I see that being lived out there, but there's a number of other churches where I get flashes of certain parts of this, but the reality as a whole is that when we survey their people, missional behavior across the network is lower than what we would want for it to be. How low? Well, in a cursory review of the numbers, in most churches, about 40% of the population are not building any intentional relationships with unbelievers. Okay, it's even higher in some, but I can say safely, conservatively, 40%. 35 to 40%, not one proclamation of the, and I don't mean, turn or burn, I mean intentional relationship with the hope of sharing their grace story. All right? Saturation, if these aren't happening, saturation doesn't happen. This is basically a reflective indicator of these two. That's what we're looking at with that. And the reality is upwards, and I just surveyed a church the other day where 70% of the population has not seen one person come to know Jesus in the last year. Okay? I think it's fair to say 55 to 60% of all congregants at this point of churches surveyed, which is a wide variety over a number of geographies, different denominations throughout the network, that it's about 55 to 60% of population does not see one person come to know Jesus in a 12-month time period. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say I think missional behavior is down. Does that make sense? In addition, we also know that gifting awareness, so when we ask a question like, how aware are you of gifting? You'll know that we ask that question on a scale of 1 to 10, if you remember that question in the survey. And we answer the question of 1 to 10 on grace story articulation. Those are two very straightforward questions in our survey. Now, I'm not saying that the survey is the silver bullet of understanding all of this, but it's a straightforward question. A 1 to 10 scale is what we call in research a semantic differential. Okay? So what we mean when we say that is it's 70% and above is passing. 6 and below is failure. Okay? So when we look at our church and we ask the question, what is the average response to this question? It's about a 6.4 out of 10. Okay? That's just our church. Okay, so basically, if you took a test and you got a 64, I would ask you the question, are you happy with the result? So that's what we mean when we say that. It's about the same here. It's about a 6.2 to 6.5, depending on which churches you survey, out of 10. So, as a researcher, the reason why I say that this is lower than what we would want is my imagination is that you all wouldn't be super jazzed about that. Okay, so that's kind of where when I make this arrow down, that's what I mean when I say that. I'm just framing the conversation, so just bear with me because I'm going to open it up for discussion. So if this is what we say we're going after, just like the outcomes produce these behaviors, that's our hope, right? We do have some findings of churches throughout our network, our partners throughout the country. The reality is this: if we get to a point where we agree that this is not what we want, I think we have to ask ourselves some honest questions. Number one is, if we are leading people, right now. When we look at our own life, do we really see this being borne out in Monday to Saturday living in your individual life? You have the answer to that. I don't. But I think before we start making assumptions on how to lead people, I think it's always good for us as leaders to just say, am I doing this? I will be very honest with you and say 2 years ago, my wife and I said, no, we're not doing this. Meaning, we are not, I'm going all over the country talking about outcomes, talking about missional behavior, and the reality was I couldn't look anywhere in my own life and see that I was doing this. It was very humbling to admit that. My wife and I came out of an FCA background. We were constantly sharing the gospel on college campuses, building relationships with athletes. I mean, I've got probably 15 to 20 friends that are in the NHL, Major League Baseball, or the NFL. And when I looked at it, I mean, and I'm just being honest with you, when I asked myself this question, the last time I had seen somebody come to know Jesus was 2005. And I was asking myself that question in 2010. Okay? So it's humbling to admit that, but I had to honestly ask myself the question, am I actually living this out, or am I just trying to communicate something that is not personal to me? Okay? I think a second thing that we need to look at is, are we as intentional in how we lead our people in this as we think we are? Okay, so the idea that I put out there is like, we have curriculum. I mean, I can, no matter what ministry, people can talk about a curriculum and they can say, oh man, I've got this and I've got that and I've got this and I've got that, and here's what we got a good thing going. Well, all I want to do lovingly is I want to just say, if this is reality, is there a sacred cow in your curriculum? That's all I'm asking. You know the answer to that. You know if there's a certain curriculum or a certain study that you use where you get real touchy and like to say the idea, well, maybe you should kill it. I don't know that in your life. You know it. But I think that we have to ask ourselves some honest questions in our personal lives, like what I just confessed here, and are we as intentional with this as we think we are in our curriculum? Because when we get to the end of that grid, people rave about what they're doing to form people, and then they get to missional behavior. If this is what we value, and then it just kind of falls apart. The Ford gets 4 flat tires. Okay? And then the last thing I would say is, and again, these are just some thoughts that I bring to frame the conversation. Okay? That's really important for me that you understand that. I'm not trying to manipulate. I'm not trying to run an agenda. I'm just saying, like, when I look at the data, and when I'm like doing an honest assessment of, can we really accomplish this in Western New York? I think there are some real questions we have to ask ourselves. The last thing, and I've mentioned this before, is the question of a common language. Is there value in us when we look at our ministry responsibility? And I don't know the balance of this, but I feel like the question is fair. Do we need to consider a common language across the board in our ministries? Okay, so I don't know what the answer to that is, but when we were talking about missional behavior, and when we were looking at some of the grids, I went back and looked at a couple of them this week just to kind of get a feel for it. And I know that not all ministries have gone through that. And I would imagine that some ministries would do some really cool things that maybe we haven't seen yet. Okay, that there's some pretty cool stuff going on here. But if we put outcomes up on a board at the chapel, and if we put a vision statement, a mission statement up above the sanctuary, and all of a sudden these missional behaviors are now buzzwords that we all have a common understanding of, does that help us? And so what I wanted to do in that is, I just wanted to say, this is what we see, and then ask the question, invite you all into the discussion and say, hey, have we thought about this? Or I'm pushing back, I disagree on this, whatever. This is what I see in data, but you all have different looks at it. So I just wanted to open that up and begin the conversation with regard to this, and I felt it was good to frame it that way. Does that make sense? Okay. Any thoughts or questions or perspective?
My first thought and question is, when was the last time, or have we clearly laid this out to the congregation in terms of what we wish for them to be?
Yeah.
I know that's happened in this clear form.
Yeah. The answer is, like, if we're walking through a grid of understanding where we hit church level stuff, we hit outcomes, and we hit behavior, we've never done it that way. The thing that we have done that Jerry did exhaustively, and we actually are using it now, giving it to other churches, is the Elemental series. So that's where it was 12 weeks. Jerry took 3 weeks for each outcome, and it's a great series. Like I've gone back and I've been looking at it just because, I'm just looking at my own life and just saying, man, like if this is what we say we're about, what do we think? But we've never, as far as I can tell, I don't remember laying out the church level stuff directly, and I don't remember missional behavior directly coming out in terms of a teaching series per se. It's a good question.
And I'm not even necessarily even just asking on a Sunday morning, but does this even exist in terms of a resource that we can articulate and communicate to?
In terms of rolling out the grid, no. But if you look at Renovation 101, it would hit on all the outcomes and it would hit on missional behavior.
Yep.
And I think that, people can poke holes in it, but it's dead on with regard to what we say we want.
And that was public, so yeah.
That was public, yeah.
I think one thing we've done as a church is we put the capacity to post your grace story you guys set up on the website.
Mm-hmm.
Then my last birthday, I was able to use that. Because usually on your birthday, people who use Facebook, it kind of pops up. Not that they really care if you remember it was your birthday.
Yeah.
Oh. So typically on your birthday, you get a lot of hits to your page. So last birthday, I used the grace story link that you guys set up and posted it on my homepage. So I figured people would go on there, and I said, hey, here's something that's really changed my life.
Yeah.
Hope they didn't see it. So I feel like you guys have set up one platform, at least on our website, that works pretty effective. Well, I don't know if it's effective, measure, but I'm saying.
Yeah.
You put it out there.
Yeah,
Some
an
of this
opportunity.
terminology.
Yeah.
I wonder, I understand what John's saying because I'm wondering if there was just like even a personal one that we could make available, like, hey, why don't you address your own personal missional behavior, and it kind of walks through the steps or like at least the grid, and then maybe, whether we want to do that through ministries or if, Jerry mentions it through a message or whatever, but challenge people to personally, walk through the grid in their own life and with their families.
Yeah, I had talked to Mike about that in terms of our small group a couple weeks ago. A couple months ago, we walked that through the grid for our group and have totally changed our direction because of it. So it is a good tool for groups or for individuals to walk through.
I know, like, as a case study, this last year, my small group focused on the 4 outcomes as a indicator for missional behavior. And to be honest, Friday we dissolved the group because what happened was, as we got through this, we realized that we had 3 separate passions. Mine was with fostering and with the inner city. The Caputi family was with international students. The Burgums had an interest in the Clarence area. And we got to the point where we were, and my sister, who has a heart for the inner city, but also is leading a lot of people into opportunities to hear her story in industry at NCO. She's had a heart for her coworkers. The reality was, we felt like instead of trying to force us to get why not reposition ourselves into our passions? And I know that may sound like, I don't know what people think about that. I don't even know what I think about it, to be honest. But we felt like the right thing to do was release you into your passion. Don't feel like we got to keep being friends forever, because if our relationships with each other are more important than going out, I think there's a problem there. And to be honest, in the past, I've chosen the relationships with believers over my responsibility to the lost. And I'm not saying that I figured it out. I'm just saying on Friday it was an emotional night of coming to the conclusion that the best thing was probably to kill this group so that we can release ourselves into what we're really passionate about.
Right, I think that's great. I made a note for us to get together and find out how we can communicate that as a win story to other groups.
Okay.
Just to open it up and give people permission to say, hey, it's not all about these groups. these groups are here for a reason. We're trying to help you represent the gospel well in your life, and if it isn't accomplishing that, don't waste your time. Kind of
Yeah.
thing. So it's cool.
Yeah.
And again, not to make it feel like you're just robots and we're just trying to get this, bottom line established. But if it doesn't make sense with your gifting, all the stuff we talk about,
Yeah.
do something different. It's great.
I would just comment that I think that's a great idea if you have self-starters. But if you have people who are not self-starters, they still need the context of the group accountability.
Okay.
And everybody needs accountability, obviously. Because otherwise they move into mission drift and priorities get altered and very subtly.
Can I, that's a good point, Pastor Rich. I'm gonna put non-self-starters. I don't know how else to articulate that. Yeah, because I definitely, like some people that have that entrepreneurial bone, they're, it's like, hey, let's do this.
It's like an open classroom versus a self-contained classroom. Why?
Right.
Because some people perform better
Sure.
as self-starters.
Yeah, that's fair. Can I ask a question like, the sacred cow comment that I made earlier, like is it worth a discussion in this realm of just saying like, look, do we agree or do you have pushback, like maybe an honest assessment of all curriculum we use? Like, is it really driving toward these things? Are we willing to take a look at that? Does that make sense? Did I articulate that okay, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll say, related to that, and I'm sorry, my throat and voice is kind of weird today. But,
Sure.
related to what you're saying and with what John recommended to me a few weeks back, pretty soon that's something that I want to begin doing is creating some stuff, specifically in the context of circle groups, because we just changed the name. The language is really, not that we do it all based around these concepts, but the language and the intent and the direction is to go this way. Like, how can you go back into your circles? And so I have every intention of creating stuff that is specifically like, you could use this in your group, or these are things that people in your group, you may not gather and discuss them as they are, but to be used in individual purposes.
Yeah.
So
That's good.
and just to open up, because I will be doing that anyway, I'm willing to partner with whoever else wants to if we tweak things to fit their context, or if we make it general enough that it applies across the board. I'm totally open with that.
Right. Linda, did you have a?
We have found it helpful to mark the differential levels of meeting women where they are, but always with the idea of taking them where they need to go in the intentionality of their discipleship and moving them along. And we've actually found it successful in the fact that the ones who are willing or want to, they're moving along, and then they are actually out doing more of the missional thing that so we try to we're raising that bar a little bit more in how we're teaching and how we're pushing through the outcomes through the Bible studies, no matter what's happening. Plus, our breakaway weekend this year is all about these things as the churches come together, pushing the mission. We still have
Can I
work
push
to
back
do.
just a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay,
sure.
so when we were going through the grid for women's ministry and we got to the outcomes and then we got to missional behavior, I asked a very specific question, which was, how do you know that this is actually happening? And in asking, and I'm asking, I'm just asking because I'm asking for the good of the body. I really wasn't convinced that what you had to say in those areas was really happening.
I'm putting more notes. I'm redoing that because I don't think I got to say everything I did because we got into a question and everybody started talking. And I'm going to put more notes in there because I realized that wasn't explained fully, and I just haven't had time to do that.
But I think that's my point in that, is if that's not the first thing you're talking about, is it fair to say, I don't think you're getting it for your people to cultivate them. And I'm saying this in my own, even in my own small group, I'm asking these questions saying, am I really cultivating this? And I think it plays out to the ministry leader level too. And so I'm not trying to be difficult, but I am trying to say, if I recall correctly in watching it, I'm not sure that was really the first thing that was coming out communicatively in those sections.
Well, that still doesn't mean that it wasn't happening.
Well,
So-
I just don't want it to turn into that kind of a conversation, because it is, like, for instance, I think most curriculum that we've put out there, we could turn around and say that, okay, it's gonna lead to these things eventually, but what we're missing is the idea behind common language and using that to help to shape the culture that we have here. Men's ministry can do the same thing. I mean, when Scott and I were putting together basics and deploy and all those things, sure, you could say that these things were all touched on in that curriculum, but now Leroy and I are talking about, okay, the value of common language. We need to look at, does this still make sense? Do we need to look at revisiting everything that's being done in that space? And I think it's for the benefit of, the culture we're trying to create here. Sure, most of the stuff out there is great, and it's going to meet, the end goal eventually. But then again, I mean, Ryan, you're raising the question, are we even really meeting that goal at the end of the day if we can't turn around and say, presence and proclamation, saturation become our primary objectives? Are people hearing that as they're, going through any type of discipleship program that we have?
Yeah, I had a question, right? Because you said that you would point to 2 churches that are really
Yeah.
they're making this happen. Specifically, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these churches were planted with this DNA from the outset. So when Missio was planted, when Summit Upstate was planted, they made it part of their core DNA that the first thing that they needed to do was address every one of these domains. Okay, so in the realm of church requirements, from day one, their church understood a DNA rhythm, which was we are to partner with other churches, and when we hear about partnering with other churches, we celebrate it. Obviously, churches that they're on the same page with. We need to be geographically intentional. So initiatives that they would come up with, they opened the creative door and said, what is it that we could do for our community, the zip code or the region that we're in? So they did a number of tangible things to try to bring the kingdom. Gas buy down. They took a ton of money from that was given to them for their denomination and their tithe, and they said, we're given this, we're going to pumps across the region you may not like the idea, but this was a tangible expression. And what they would do is just say, we're going to buy your gas today. And they would do this repeatedly. They would close church on Sunday to go and be out in the community. I'm not saying that these are things that we can do, but then they also started talking about interdependence. And instead of, like, our methodology here in Western New York was, let's gather a bunch of churches and let's go through the renovation curriculum. What they did, because they were smaller, was Jason and Kyle, the co-pastors down there, they made they kind of, the way I describe it is they fought the Revolutionary War. So instead of fighting the British straight on, they said, who are key people in Summit, in the upstate region of South Carolina? Who are key people that we need to come alongside of and drip feed the renovation line of thinking to? And so 3-4 years later, they've got 3 church plants themselves. They get to about, don't hold me to this, but they get to about 200 and then they hive off. They do a new location. Okay, so it's on the church level, that's how they've addressed those church level specifications. They've built key relationships with people. They've done very intentional stuff in their geography. Not just like a gas buy down, but cleaning up neighborhoods, closing the church, going and helping other churches. This was something that they decided to do, was like on a Sunday, let's go attend another church, and then after, let's help clean their church up. What are the needs that they tangibly have? Is it paint? Is it landscaping? Whatever it is that they could do to express their appreciation for the existing bride. In the outcomes level, when we talk about intimacy with God, Christ-like relationships, discovering your gifting, knowing your story, they literally built their whole small group infrastructure around those outcomes. And they built membership around those outcomes. They built new attenders around those outcomes. So it was basically like, that's what we like, so that's what we'll build. Which when you really think about it, it's way easier to do this. To birth it with this in mind. And then with missional behavior, what they went through is they do 2 things. One is they went through our survey that we created, and I walked them through, and they actually had a very low conversion growth rate, believe it or not. They are in, as Jason describes it, the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. I didn't know that there was a part of that, but that's what he says they're in. Bob Jones University is in that town, and so there's. But what they did was they said, look, these are our benchmarks, and then every half year they would come back to the outcomes and they would ask their congregants, how are we doing with these outcomes? As in, how are you doing in your own life? And so they've just made it very intentional to say that missional behavior matters to us, and we could build it from the ground up. Jordan did the exact same thing with Jim Murphy and with Bernie and with Mike Mazie. The thing that Jordan is doing that's different than the upstate guys is when Dwight talks about the 411 model, they literally staff their key leadership around that model. So they have an evangelist, they have the four gifts. They have an evangelist, they have a pastor, they have an apostolic guy, and they have a prophetic guy, and they interdepend on one another. And so when people ask them how did they set their church up, they use that model and say, maybe you should consider this. And so, but they've done a lot of the similar things that Jason and Kyle have done, just contextually in Syracuse. And so when I look at that, I don't know that that's something we could do, because we weren't birthed that way. But I think that there are some things that we can grab onto that. And what I wanted to say was, and I wanted to, John, I don't know if I was clear on this, so I wanted to make sure I was. I'm not saying that we recreate new curriculum. I'm not saying that at all. I think that there's lots of great curriculum out there that probably suits a lot of the needs and the desires. Here's what I am saying. When you think about that curriculum, can you frame this language in and around it intentionally?
Yeah.
Not look at it from the backside saying, oh yeah, we do that, but do people know what this language really means? That's all I'm saying. And it may be that we create new curriculum, but I'm not saying that we have to. Is that
One thing I just keep thinking about, this seems to be a conversation we've come back to a couple times as far as curriculum goes, as far as just some more priorities. I think the question that we should be asking is the curriculum that we have and the priorities that we have, does it spawn new curriculum or new desire to come to more teaching environments, or does it spawn a desire to go out and do this stuff? And that's, I guess, where I'm at.
That's good.
Yeah,
Real quick, Wes, did that make sense what I was
Yeah,
saying?
that's
Okay,
exactly
great. I'm sorry I didn't close the loop on that. I'm sorry.
Well, and this is kind of to follow up with that. So when you say they get it, you've described how they started with a common language and created everything around that. But did you find in their survey results that it was considerably higher on those numbers?
It's on the rise, yeah. And Missio is one of the largest conversion growth churches that we've seen. Now, that's assuming we value...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But like with these, like where would they fall? You threw some numbers out for us.
Yeah.
How does that look for them?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
Okay.
So we're about to find that out with Missio here in the next couple of months. So they went through, and on the front end, they wanted to grow, like if we were to, the average person, like, this is gonna sound like not a big deal. Our average, their average was at 1, 1, and 0, okay? So their desire is to get to 3, 3, and 1, okay? But with conversion, because saturation is a component of that. So the average person was building one intentional relationship when we first went and examined them. The average person was sharing their story one time a year, and the average person had led nobody to Jesus, according to the median, which is that really conservative form. So what their desire is expressing this intentionality, okay? Can we get to 3, 3, and 1? Can the average person have been building 3 intentional relationships with unbelievers? Can the average person have been sharing their story at least one time with those people throughout the course of a year? And can the average person have led one person to Jesus in the last 12 months? That we will begin to collect that in the next couple of months. When we get back into the school year, that's when Missio is going to redo it. So tangibly speaking, I think, and I don't know if people agree with this, so this is a great question. I'm not as really convinced that we can move the median on this one, but I absolutely believe that we can move relationships here, that we have a responsibility to do so. And so even though, like, let's say Missio comes back and it's 3-3-0. It was 1-1-0 and now it's 3-3-0. If you were to ask me, have they succeeded? The answer is yes. in my opinion as a researcher. Would I want this to move to like 1 or 2? Of course I do. But if I were to conceptualize success coming out of that, it would be to see these numbers move up. Yeah.
For Missio and Summit, do they have what I guess I would just call like demographic specific ministry? In other words,
Yeah.
we have a wide variety of ministries depending on your age group and family situation. Most, I have no data on this, but
Yeah.
it seems like most upstarting churches are moving towards small group emphasis, probably children and student ministry, but really beyond that, if you're 18 or older, you're in a small group and that's your primary. So do they have those kinds of things at Missio and Summit?
Do they have like traditional ministries? At
Yeah,
some-
like a men's and women's, the
Yeah.
singles. Okay.
I mean, I obviously it's not. I think it's probably not as exhaustive as this.
Right.
It's a fiscal issue.
Yeah.
But here's what I would say is, if you were to ask me, do they live with a greater level of geographic intentionality compared to maybe what we're living at right now? In my gut, I would say I think that they do, and here's why. For every new expression that they plant, they've thought about the geography of where they'd go next. And so I'm not saying, again, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that we need to exhibit this model. I think there are some things that we can learn from them.
Yeah.
But I also feel like the autonomy of the bride is important too, and our context is different.
Yeah.
But I do feel that the geographic intentional rhythm lives alive and well in those churches as it relates to where do we go next for our geography. But if you were to say, like, I think their biggest focus is on small group community. In fact, I don't know that they have singles, and I don't know that they have like divorce care or stuff like that. They may, but I know that the small group infrastructure is a huge nucleus for them on the Monday to Saturday.
Right, and the reason I brought that up was to say, if we can draw from what they're doing, and kind of turn this big ship that we have here,
Sure.
That's the goal. But they have a specific set of advantages where they didn't have existing ministries to push through this grid.
Absolutely.
So just how we apply that would be a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jonathan. Absolutely.